Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the 2024 presidential election in a scenario in which what if Joe Biden never dropped out of the race, and what if it was Biden versus Trump rematch instead of Kamala Harris? Would Joe Biden had performed better than Kamala Harris or worse, or would the results not even change at all? Let's find out in this video if that would have made a difference at the end of the day. But before we get started, make sure you guys are subscribed as we are approaching 5,000 subscribers, and click the bell so you don't miss all my content. Don't forget we have memberships. You can find links to that in the description section if you are interested, and also share this video as well. So let's begin. Starting off with the first difference, if Joe Biden decided to stay in the race instead of dropping out, so Kamala would not end up replacing him, I think he would have flipped Minnesota. I think Tim Walz as the VP pick really saved Kamala Harris ultimately. And by the way, this is the result of the 2024 election, and I'm going to be making a few adjustments to the electoral map, which things I would change. So this map right here is the results of the 2024 election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Now, the first adjustment is that Trump would win Minnesota if Joe Biden decided to stay in the race. And the only reason why, there's only one reason why Kamala won Minnesota was because of Tim Walz being her VP. Obviously, as we all know, he's the governor of this state, very popular. People often call him moderate. He's not really someone who is seen as far left at all. Therefore, he really helped Kamala at the end of the day, who is, I would say, more further to the left than someone like Tim Walz, who's kind of closer to the moderate side. And so, if Biden was in the race, I think he would perform worse than Kamala Harris in Minnesota, because he would not have Tim Walz as the VP. And yet again, he's the only reason why Kamala ended up winning this state. She only won Minnesota by about 4 percentage points, which is not even a likely margin. That's a lean margin. And majority of the polls were actually spot on the average on 530 and Real Clear Politics as well, RCP on the aggregate. Right before the election day, their final prediction was Kamala would win Minnesota by about 4 points, and guess what? The real results was she actually won it by about 4 points. And the same pollster, RCP, who was really spot on in Minnesota, who correctly predicted Kamala would win by about 4 points, they actually had practically a tie. And if Biden was leading it when he was still in the race on RCP, it was by like half of a percentage point, like 0.5%. And at some point, Donald Trump was actually leading and a few highly respected pollsters in the state of Minnesota. So I do truly believe that this would be one, thing I would change if Joe Biden decided to stay in the race. Not for the better, for the worst for Democrats, but obviously better if you're Donald Trump. I think he would have lost Minnesota. Meanwhile, Kamala would obviously win it just because of Tim Walz. That's the only reason why, as she ended up doing. And another thing I would change is that Nevada would not be lean for Donald Trump. Instead, I think it would be likely, so even further to the right, if Joe Biden decided to stay in the race. I think all around, pretty much nationwide, who'd perform much worse. And Donald Trump would win the popular vote by even more than he already did, because obviously he did win the popular vote, but instead of, the 2 million votes advantage that he has, I believe it's like 77, to Kamala Harris is like 76. I do think it would have been greater. He would expand even more votes. I think Kamala, in my opinion, would do better than Joe Biden. I think he would perform much worse. He may not. He would be lucky to even get 70 million votes. I do think Kamala is a slight improvement to Joe Biden, but they had no option. Like, the Democrats, whether they had Kamala in or Biden or even a primary, I still think if they had an open primary, they still would have lost. I think either way, no matter what they did, they were cooked no matter what. And if Biden stayed in the race, it would have been even worse for Democrats. I think Trump would have actually improved in terms of electoral votes and popular vote as well. But yet again, even if they had a primary, I think that still would not obviously be the answer for them, because obviously they would be very divided, and like they had only one candidate, one choice, so they're very united and backing support for Kamala Harris, which is they're lucky to even get 226 electoral votes. I think it actually would have been much worse if they had a primary, or if Biden stayed in the race, because they would have been much more divided, and also they would have like no time. I think Kamala Harris, in my opinion, actually did really well for someone who had like what 3 months. She had like 3 months and zero primary votes. So the fact that she had so little time and zero primary votes, she was swapped in at the last second. I think she did good, and she got like 74 million votes, which really shocked me. I didn't think she would get that much. Overall, in terms of turnout, this election had pretty high turnout, basically around the same as 2020. We didn't see a decrease at all, and we also didn't see an increase that much as well. So it's basically in par in terms of turnout from the 2020 results. So the second thing I would change is Nevada. I think Trump would win it by 5% instead of the 3.1% that he got it by against Kamala Harris. So I do see a 2% improvement for Donald Trump in Nevada if Joe Biden stayed in the race instead of Kamala Harris ultimately replacing him. Now, he actually almost won the Vegas area, Clark County, which is a Democratic stronghold. That's the only reason why Democrats have been winning in Nevada for quite some time. I actually do think he would have won Clark County, after we took a look at the 2024 election results, because Kamala only won Clark County by just about 2 percentage points. Biden would perform worse among Hispanic voters than Kamala Harris, which is the main reason why he would win. Donald Trump would win Nevada by 5 if Biden stayed instead of the 3 that Kamala, lost it by. And then Washoe County could possibly be another flip for Donald Trump if Biden stayed. So Nevada would be even more red or likely instead of lean. And I think Arizona would stay likely, but further to the right. Then instead of 5 that Kamala lost it by, I think Biden would lose it by around 7 percentage points as an example. And then another thing I would change is the state of Georgia. Biden won it in 2020 by just 0.3%. And in 2024, Donald Trump won it by just about 2 percentage points, a lean margin. I do think if Biden stayed in the race, Donald Trump would perform much, much better. I think Kamala saved Democrats in Atlanta. I don't think Biden would get a lot of turnout among African-American voters, and Kamala did. And people on the right are saying that Trump performed very well with African-American voters. That's kind of a myth. That was not the story. As we take a look at the results based off of demographics, African-American voters did not really go well for Donald Trump as much as the polls were suggesting. He only got 15%, and most of that came from males. Most African-American females heavily backed Kamala Harris. So Kamala Harris won 85% of African-American support. A lot of polls had Trump cracking 20%, and that slightly overestimate his chances. What really happened was Donald Trump nearly won the Hispanic vote. He got 45%, and guess what? He actually did win Hispanic men. Meanwhile, he lost Hispanic women. He won Hispanic men by 10% more than Kamala Harris, which was the main story. It wasn't really African-American voters. It was the Hispanic men that really turned out well for Donald Trump, which is the main reason why Nevada and Arizona voted so far to the right. Texas as well, especially Florida, which was probably the best victory for Donald Trump. So another thing I would change is Georgia. It would be likely instead of lean. He would win it by 5 instead of the 2% that Kamala lost it by. I think North Carolina would stay lean for Donald Trump by 4 points instead of the around 3%, just because Mark Robinson really hurted Donald Trump. So therefore, I don't think it would be likely even if Biden decided to stay in the race instead of dropping out. And another thing I would change is the state of Virginia. Kamala Harris won it by just about a likely margin of around a little bit over 5 percentage points. I do think it would have been closer. I think it would be tilt for Joe Biden instead of likely for Kamala Harris. So if he decided to stay in the race, I think overall he would do much worse than Kamala Harris. So they made the right decision by nominating Kamala, because I really think they honestly had no option. They were cooked either way, no matter what they did. I think Kamala was the best option, and guess what? With their best option, they still ended up losing. So no matter what they did, Donald Trump really most likely had the election in the bag for him. So I think Virginia would be tilt by just about under percentage point, and RCP nailed this state. They correctly called it 4.5 points for Kamala Harris. She won it by about 5, so RCP was spot on. But guess what? RCP also had Donald Trump winning the state of Virginia by just a week prior to him dropping out. Trump was up on average by 0.4% according to RCP. And like I just mentioned, RCP was extremely spot on with the margin for Kamala Harris. So I'm just saying Trump could have won Virginia, but I would have Biden narrowly winning it, just to be nice to him, by just about under percentage point a tilt margin. That would have been much, much closer. Actually, worse for Democrats if Biden stayed in the race. So I do think they made the right decision nominating Kamala Harris, even though that's the best decision for them. It still would not end up working out for them because they were basically cooked either way. It doesn't really matter what they would do. They were most likely losing the election. It was pretty much guaranteed. As we saw all over the world, not just in the United States, incumbent parties lost. Like, no matter if the incumbent was conservative or liberal, it does not matter. All across the world, if you were an incumbent, you were most likely losing. And that's why Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, and no matter who the candidate was on the Democratic side, was going to lose. And then another thing I would change is probably the state of New Hampshire. I do think if Biden stayed in the race, it would have been a little bit slightly worse for Democrats. I don't think he would be an improvement at all. He would just be worse than Kamala Harris. Therefore, Trump would barely win New Hampshire, pull off the victory there by under percentage point, a tilt narrow margin. I do think that Tim Walz, the impact of that, I don't really want to overrate the VP, or overstate it, but I do think that Tim Walz, having his background focusing on education as governor, he really focused on education. Keep in mind, New Hampshire, guys, has a lot of college-educated voters in that group, specifically really pins out well for Democrats. So I do think that alone helped Kamala Harris, but Joe Biden obviously would not have Tim Walz on the ticket, and he would just perform very bad. And New Hampshire was actually closer than Minnesota. So if I have Minnesota going to Donald Trump, if Joe Biden stayed in the race, I would obviously have New Hampshire as well because Minnesota was closer. Actually, New Hampshire was closer, excuse me. Kamala only won it by 3 percentage points. And then New Jersey was only lean for Kamala. She won it by around 4%. I do think it would be scary close. I mean, in reach that Donald Trump can actually possibly flip this state. That would be about a 16% shift. That's the swing to the right compared to 2020. Biden won it by 16 points, and it only went to Kamala by just about 4 percentage points. So, New Jersey is another one I would change from lean to tilt for Joe Biden. He would do worse than Kamala Harris. Actually, when he was still in the race, Donald Trump was actually very in reach of winning this state. On average, Biden was only winning New Jersey by like 5 percentage points. And the polls overall actually still overestimated Kamala Harris. So it actually would have been far worse if Joe Biden had stayed in the race. And I do think that Illinois would become likely. Kamala Harris won it by about 11%. I think Biden would probably win it by just about 6 percentage points if he decided to stay in the race. So I think overall for Democrats, him dropping out was the right decision, but they were going to lose overall because, like I just mentioned, all over the world, incumbent party lost. No matter if they were right or left, does not matter. If you're an incumbent, you're most likely going to get unseated. So no matter who was on the Democratic ticket, whether it's Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro, instead of Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, they would probably still wind up losing. Donald Trump pretty much had it, locked down in the bag for him. And then New York went to Kamala by about 12 percentage points. I think that would be decided within single digits when Biden was still in the race. The averages on 530 and RCP he was winning it by only 7 to 8 percentage points. So I think it would have been better for Donald Trump, but still not enough for him to obviously overcome the votes in deep blue states like New York as well. So that is pretty much it. Also, I think Wisconsin would be lean instead of tilt, as we all know Trump won it by just about 0.8 percentage points, which is exactly his margin from 2016 in the state of Wisconsin. I do think he'd win it by closer to 3 percentage points if Biden decided to stay in the race. So it would have been much worse. I think Kamala Harris actually performed better than I expected in the state of Wisconsin. Keep in mind, this state had voted to the right of both Michigan and Pennsylvania in 2020, 2016 as well. So that one really caught me off guard. I was surprised that Wisconsin actually had voted to the left of Michigan and Pennsylvania, which was the opposite for recent prior elections past. So there you guys go. This is the final election map. If Biden had stayed in the race, I think Trump would have gained 14 more electoral votes, which is pretty significant in my opinion. That's a big boost. 326 to Joe Biden's 212. So with Kamala Harris obviously replacing Biden, it got Democrats 226 electoral votes. But if Joe Biden stayed in the race, I think he would perform 14 electoral votes worse. Trump would get 2 more states that he lost to Kamala. Those are Minnesota and New Hampshire, getting 14 more electoral votes. So instead of 312, if Biden stayed, it would become 326 electoral votes. So even more of a disaster for Democrats than what it pretty much already was. So that's pretty much it. Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. Do you agree that Joe Biden would perform worse than Kamala Harris, getting 326 electoral votes for Donald Trump? One last final reminder is to subscribe, click the bell so you don't miss all my content. Press like button, share this video. Don't forget we do have memberships. You can find the links in the description section if you are interested. Thank you everyone for watching. Oh, and one last thing, I do think New Mexico would have been lean for Joe Biden by just like 4.5 percentage points instead of likely she won it by 6 points. So I do think Trump would perform 2 points better, if Biden was in the race rather than Kamala Harris. So instead of the 6 that Kamala won New Mexico by, I think it would have been 4 for Joe Biden. So that's the last final change.